Hello everybody and welcome to AskTrains.com for March 2023. We're going to kick off the show here in the David P. Morgan Memorial Library. Our first question comes to us from Paul. He writes in, I recall seeing an item in Model Railroader concerning converting the tender of an IHC HO scale Mikado steam locomotive so that it would provide electrical pickup of track power. Could you please inform me as to which issue, year or month, that this article was published? Paul, I'm going to go around the corner and grab the issue that you're looking for. Well, here you are in one of my favorite aisles in the library. This is where all the individual copies of Model Railroader and Trains magazine are kept. Paul, the issue that you're looking for is from July 2006. That's going to be in this box right here. And, thankfully, it's the front one in our collection right here. So the article you're looking for was on page 26. And it starts right down here about rewiring an IHC Mikado. So it starts on 26, and then that story jumps onto page 28 where it concludes. So again, you want to check out the July 2006 issue. Pages 26 and 28 will help you get that IHC HO scale Mikado rewired. One of the joys of model railroading is recreating memories. And that leads to our next question. Jim writes in, my goal is to model the Hoboken and Brick Church stations on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. Do you know where I might find HO scale DL&W MU cars? I was thinking about getting Concord MU MP54 cars and airbrushing them. What is the proper color? Pullman green or Brunswick green? What is a good source for the paint? Before I answer your question, Jim, I thought I would show our viewers what the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western MU cars look like. And I've got a couple different books here. First is the Lackawanna Railroad in color. And here you can see a couple different photos of some of the MU cars in action on the railroad. I also found some other pictures of the cars in this book here. This is Lackawanna Railroad Trackside with Henry W. Peterson. And as we flip towards the back of the book, there are more color photos of the MU54 cars. Not only are these color images great for paint references, but it also helps you when it comes to weathering models. Jim, I'm happy to say that I was able to find a source for DL&W MU coaches as well as low-level and high-level trailers. Those are available from a company called Island Model Works. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find photos of these models on the website, but they are a source for those models. Now, I should point out that these are craftsman-level kits, and they do not include things like couplers, wheels, or screws. Now, if you're looking for an off-the-shelf option, I think it's perfectly reasonable to use the Concord MU MP54 cars. You want to paint those Pullman green. I found that that was the color, not Brunswick green. True Color Paint offers it in jars that you can use for airbrushing, and they also offer it as a gloss spray paint. If you're looking for acrylic options, you can turn to companies like Rail Center. That's a new company that has Pullman green by name in its product range. Another company that offers acrylic Pullman green is Modelers Decals and Paint, and you can find that Pullman green in the Kalmbach Hobby Store. Now, in addition to the paint companies that offer Pullman green by name, you may also consider using Tamiya spray paint. When I did the Chicago and Northwestern commuter car series for our Ultimate Guide special issue, as well as video projects, I used a couple different shades of their green spray paint, and I thought both of the colors were fairly reasonable matches for Pullman green. Again, just because the name doesn't say Pullman green doesn't mean it won't work for your project. Oh, hey, Eric.
Hey, Cody, how you doing?
Good. Looks like you're busy at work on our next project layout here.
Yeah, we finally got some power attached and we can see how the trains run.
I see you got a couple locomotives here for testing purposes, so.
Yeah, this is a beautiful one from the Winston-Salem southbound and one of our Virginian locomotives.
Yeah, well, Eric, that leads nicely into our next question here from John, and he writes, I see a lot of layouts that don't seem to have a way of turning the trains around. Do they back the train to the beginning, or do they just manually pick the train up and turn it around in the opposite direction? Now, Eric, of course, our layout here does not have any way of turning or Ying a locomotive.
No.
So in this case, there are a couple different options. Why don't we talk first about diesel locomotives, because they're set up that they can really run in either direction.
Right, it doesn't really matter in a lot of trains in the real world. They'll run out one direction and just run back. And in fact, that's true of some steam locomotives as well, especially a smaller one like this Virginia engine.
Yeah, that's a good point, Eric. I think a lot of the branch lines I grew up around, they would run down till the end of the line, get their work done, and they come back and be long hood forward. And like you said, with steam engines too, especially on some of the smaller branch lines, running tender first wasn't unheard of.
Right.
Now on model railroads, you know, turntables, Ys, things like that, that all equals space.
It does.
And that's something that most modelers wish they had more of. But there's some nice options here. It looks like we have this Pico device here, Eric, for turning locomotives if you are so inclined to do that.
Yeah, this is a Flexi Loco lift from Pico, and this is really nice because, especially with a model like this, a steam locomotive, there's all these appliances on the side there. You kind of get nervous about if I squeeze this enough to be able to lift it, am I going to break something?
Exactly. And even the same with some of the diesel locomotives today, too. We're starting to see a lot more detail on the trucks and the piping and cabling underneath there, too. So why don't we go ahead and demo this here?
Sure.
All right, so Eric, I think what I'm going to do is we'll get the diesel out of the way, and then we'll back this Virginian steam locomotive onto the Flexi Loco lift so people can get an idea of how easy it is to use. So if all works as advertised, we should be able to back the 251 right onto here.
Nice.
Right, maybe a little more here. So then, Eric, if you want to show lifting it up, and then we could easily turn it around and have it running the opposite direction for the next session.
Oh, don't tip it.
Lined up there.
Yep.
Lined up on the front.
Yes.
All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll run it in reverse. So now we'll back it off of the loco lift. Then we can just move that off the layout, and we're good to go. So John, many times the reason you don't see Ys and turntables on a layout is because there simply isn't the space, as you can see on our project layout here. So that's where things like the Pico Flexi Loco lift come in handy. As Eric demonstrated, he could safely and easily pick up our steam locomotive, turn it the opposite direction, and have it ready for the next session. Well, Eric, thanks for joining me for that question.
Sure.
Well, I'll let you get back to work on the layout. I've got a few more questions to answer over at the bench.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks, Eric. Okay, we're in the workshop for the next section of the show here, and leading things off is a question from Jeff. He writes in, I have an old model rectifier Control Master 5 transformer from the 1970s. It has a track voltage adjustment knob on it, but there are no numbers around it. How do I know what the voltage is? I have locomotives ranging from Z scale up to O scale. How do I know what voltage to use on them? Can I still use the Control Master 5 with new locomotives? Well, Jeff, let's kind of unpack that question in several stretches here. First, we'll talk about the Control Master 5. I did a Google search for that controller, and I actually found on the Model Rectifier Corporation website the operator's manual for this. As you can see, it's quite old. It looks like it's probably typewritten, so that gives you an idea. It's from more than a few days ago here. But when I flip through it, Section 8 talks about the track voltage adjustment control. And it kind of walks through how to do that. But at the very end, it says something very important. It says, we recommend use of a track voltage meter. And that's because, like you said, there are no numbers around that dial, so you don't know exactly where you have that voltage adjustment set to. When it comes to track voltage meters, one that we like to use in the Model Railroader Workshop is this one here. It's called the RR amp meter, and it's a DCC, AC, and DC volt ammeter produced by American Hobby Distributors. This device can work with DCC when the green light illuminates and AC when the red light illuminates. And then it has two displays, the top for volts, the bottom for amps. Now you can use this in one of two ways. You can either put the contacts onto the rail and it'll read out that way, or you can use a plug here and just plug it into the end and then hook the alligator clamps up to the rails and it'll display the same way. So it'll work both ways, whichever one you're more comfortable using. Now for the next part of your question, Jeff, I recommend looking at the operating instructions included with most locomotive models. Now I happen to have one here. This is from the F40PH that was produced in HO scale by Rapido Trains. On page 12 of the manual, there's a section here in this box with a heading warning. In the first sentence here, it says, Rapido products are designed to operate safely between 0 volts and 16 volts. One other thing I should point out in this box is it also points out that some older power supplies can cause damage to decoders. And here it mentions some of them by name. So you got like the MRC Rail Power 1300/1370 series, Bachmann Spectrum Magnum, Atlas 313 Universal Power Pack. So again, you want to adhere to the instructions spelled out by the manufacturer. I have another example here. This one's from a Walthers mainline locomotive. And under the section heading DC operation, it says, please note, when operating Walthers branded DCC equipped locomotives in DC mode, do not use power packs that exceed an 18-volt rating. This includes MRC 1300 series power packs, which have known issues with our decoders. Now, if you don't have printed paperwork like this with your models, reach out to the manufacturer directly. Most have either an email contact form or a phone number that you can reach them at to find out the specifics on your locomotive. Now, the last part of your question, Jeff, was whether or not you can use the Control Master 5 with modern locomotives. Now, it's entirely possible you could, but I really wouldn't recommend it. There are many newer systems out there, and I would be concerned about things like voltage spikes, irregular waveforms, and other things like that that may harm the electronics in contemporary locomotives. So I'd probably say, you know what, the Control Master 5 gave me many years of good service, but we'll put it aside and use something newer. Our next question brings us over to the MR locomotive testing station area. And Pete writes in, I recently acquired 10 locomotives, a mix of steam and diesel, at an estate sale. 3 of the 10 have digital command control, the balance are direct current. Can I run a DCC equipped locomotive on a DC layout without damaging the DCC control system? Pete, if those DCC equipped locomotives have a dual mode decoder, then you can certainly run them on DC. Now, I've set up this Atlas HO scale MP15 DC locomotive, which has a dual mode DCC sound decoder. And I've got this DC power pack here to run the locomotive with, and this is going to help me illustrate a few of the caveats about running a decoder equipped locomotive on a DC layout. The one thing you'll notice right away is that there is a higher starting voltage. So let's start that up. I have our RR amp meter here, so you can watch as the voltage starts to climb before you start to notice things like the headlights turn on, the sound effects kick in, and things like that. So let's go ahead and start that up. So about 7.8. And just slowly advance as you can see where it starts to kick in. Okay, so at 9.4 volts, you hear the decoder kick in. That beeping sound is the engine startup sequence. It's not a short circuit. You also notice that the headlights and ditch lights are starting to blink a little bit, but as I advance the voltage a bit more, so there we are, we're at about 10 volts. Notice that the headlights, number boxes, and ditch lights are all on constantly now. Now, as I advance the throttle, you'll notice the voltage will increase, and eventually the locomotive is going to start to move. However, the speed range on the locomotive under DC control isn't going to be as wide as if I were running it with a digital command control decoder. So let's watch here, and we'll start advancing the throttle. Okay, so we're at about 11.7 here, and the locomotive's starting to move at a slow crawl here. And I'll advance it a little more. You can see at 13.2, it's starting to move along a little quicker. But again, nowhere near the range you would if you were running it under DCC power. In addition to the higher starting voltage and the more limited speed range, there are other things that you will also have limitations on when using DC to control a decoder-equipped locomotive. In DCC operation, when you activate the horn, the ditch lights flash in an alternating pattern. I wasn't able to do that with our DC power pack. You also have a more limited sound selection too. You basically get the diesel rumble, and as the voltage increases and you advance the throttle, you'll notice that the engine rev picks up too. But you lose other things like the ability to do manual notching, brake squeal, and set some of those individual sound and lighting effects that you can with a DCC controller. Now, some companies have developed ways to work around that. And one example of that is Broadway Limited Imports. They make this device here called the DC Master. This is one we've had around the workshop for a while, and it still has the Precision Craft Models label on it. Now, the DC Master is specific to products from Broadway Limited Imports. For example, their Blue Line, Paragon 2, Paragon 3, and Paragon 4 steam and diesel locomotives. But when you operate those locomotives using a DC power pack, If you make this part of the system, you can activate features like the bell, the horn, and the volume. So Pete, you can indeed operate a decoder-equipped locomotive on a DC layout. Just be aware that you're going to have a higher starting voltage, some of your light and sound functions are going to be limited, and your speed range isn't going to be as great as it would be with DCC. Our next question is related to the Kalmbach Hobby Store, specifically one of the sets that we sell. Joe writes in, while visiting the Kalmbach Hobby Store website, I came across the Bullseye Drill and Tap Jig Set, number 84305. The listing didn't specify what scale or models the tool is compatible with. Any additional information you can provide would be appreciated. The Bullseye Drill and Tap Jig is designed for Athearn cars that have these guys right here. And this is a metal draft gearbox cover plate. Now these draft gearbox covers date back to the Blue Box kit days, but they can still be found on contemporary Athearn offerings, such as cars here from the Ready to Roll line and the Roundhouse line. And I took the car from the Roundhouse line out so you can see that it indeed does still have the metal draft gearbox cover. So what was the problem with those covers? Well, it was mainly how they were designed to be fastened to the car, because those covers have little openings that go over these tabs right here. And what could happen over time is if there was a hard coupling, or if you took that plate on or off a few times, these little tabs could eventually shear off, and then your coupler would never really stay secured to the car. So A-Line came up with this really clever system here. It's Bullseye Drill, Jig, and Tap system to help secure these with screws. First, we'll take a quick look at what you get with this set. So you get the number 50 drill bit, which I've already put into a pin vise. You get the drill and tap jig here. You get a 256 tap, which I've already put into a tap wrench. And you also get a half a dozen 256 by 1/8 inch screws. I've already used a couple of them, so I'm down to 4. But we'll go ahead and start by drilling the clearance hole. So for that, I'm going to want the clearance drill jig as well as the number 50 bit. Now you'll notice that there is a beveled edge right here. And this part is beveled because you want this flat face here to seat flat on the floor of the draft gearbox. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this in. I'm going to put that beveled edge against the back of the box. So now I'm going to go in, and you just want to keep that jig at a perpendicular angle to the draft gearbox. And then just go through and start drilling until you are all the way through the plastic. Now you may need to back the bit out a few times and clear out the jig. So I'll take a quick peek where we're at here. All right, so we've made a little dent here. We have a bit more to go. All right, we should be just about through the plastic here. Quick peek, see? Yep, you can see that we've gone through the hole. So we'll just go ahead and clean that up, and then we can move on to the tap wrench. Now which one is that? That's the one that has the wider opening and top. So this is our drill jig and then the tap jig. So similar to the drill jig, this one has the beveled edge which seats against the back of our box. Then we'll come in with our tap wrench and we will start threading the hole. Now this is where you want to make sure that you keep things nice and vertical, because if you thread the hole at an angle, the screw and the draft gearbox won't seat properly. So now we'll just back things out. So now we have our hole threaded. So the final step is to get a coupler, just drop it into place, and then we will put the draft gearbox cover on top, like that. Now this car still has its tabs, so that draft gearbox cover is going to click into place nicely, but if it was missing those tabs, this is where the screw comes in handy. Drive it down. We'll make sure that that coupler swings freely in both directions. It does. And there we go. We have our draft gearbox nice and securely installed with a Phillips head screw. So Joe, that's where the Bullseye Drill, Jig, and Tap comes in handy. And if you have some old Athearn cars with the metal draft gearbox covers on your layout, you want to get this tool and put it to use. Wood kits have been a part of the hobby for many years, and staining them is a great way to give them a realistic look. And that leads to our next question. Paul writes in, I'm going to build my first wood structure kit. Do you use commercial stains or do you mix your own? What tips do you have for staining wood? Paul, I've used both commercial stains as well as those that I've mixed on my own. Let's start with those that I mix on my own. The key ingredients you need are 70% isopropyl alcohol, some India ink, and a pint container. Now, in an article that Lance Mindheim wrote for Model Railroader several years ago, he talked about different ratios for mixing for different situations. So he recommended 1/2 teaspoon of ink to a pint of alcohol to apply over white structures just to help tone them down and to help some of the details stand out. For general use, Lance recommends using 1 teaspoon of ink to a pint of 70% isopropyl alcohol. And for weathering things like brick structures, he uses 2.5 teaspoons of ink per pint of 70% isopropyl alcohol. Now, if you don't want to mix your own stains or you're looking for different colors, you can use off-the-shelf options. One that I like to use is by Hunterline. They have a nice range of stains in different colors. They have like pressure-treated green, blue, brown, creosote, all sorts of different colors for many different applications. So these are pre-mixed and ready to use. So all you have to do is just shake them up a little bit and you're good to go. Now, as far as application, the one thing I will say is that you want to stain the wood before you build the kit. If you use CA or wood glue to build the kit and then apply the stain, any spot where that glue has oozed out is going to seal the wood. So any spots like in the middle of a wall, the stain's going to soak in real nice and thorough. But any spots where that glue has weeped out of a joint, that's going to seal the wood, and the stain's not going to penetrate those locations. So you have some kind of weird little spots at corner joints and places like that where you've applied glue. So again, get that stain on before you do any building. With that, let me go ahead and show you how to apply the stain. Now, since you're using ink, you want to make sure that you glove up to keep anything off your hands. As far as application tools, a paintbrush, or in my case, a foam paintbrush, works just fine here. So I'm going to dunk the brush into the India ink wash, and then we're just going to apply it working with the grain here. And what I like to do is apply that wash to both sides. And that's going to help the stain soak through and also hopefully minimize the warping a little bit. But because you're dealing with isopropyl alcohol, that means that there's water in here, and water is going to cause the wood to warp. So after you have the stain applied, you want to put this under some books. Maybe wrap a piece of paper towel around it, and then put a couple heavy books on it. Let it dry thoroughly, usually half a day is good enough, and the piece will be ready to use. Now, you may still have a little bit of warping issues, but if you use strip wood to brace the walls from the interior, that'll correct most of those problems. So Paul, I wish you all the best on your wood kit project, and you can either use home mix stains or off-the-shelf options. Either way, it's going to give your building a realistic weathered finish. Our Rochelle webcam has allowed viewers from around the world to rail fan the BNSF in Union Pacific in Illinois. And our next question involves some of the cars that were seen on one of those trains. Rich writes in, watching the webcam at Rochelle, I noticed there were different variations of the support wheels for the intermodal cars. Some had a wheel set on both ends of the car, some had what appeared to be a wheel set between the cars, while some had a wheel set on both sides of the coupler. Could you discuss these differences? Rich, I certainly can. And these are just different types of well cars. So your basic well car is called a standalone well car, such as this model right here. So it has a coupler on each end. This is the B end because it has the brake wheel, and then the A end of the car. Now this well car is also kind of unique because it also has trailer hitches in it. So trailers can be lowered into the car, and then that pin here can be put on the fifth wheel on either end of the car, and it can be transported, just one trailer per well. Now you were talking about seeing some cars that had what appeared to be a truck between the units. And those are called articulated well cars. And I have a model of a 3-unit articulated well car here. So you have the articulation point here and here. Now each of these units has a letter for maintenance purposes. So this car here is the B unit because it has the brake wheel. And you'll also see that stencil right here. You see the letter B stenciled on the car. The one on the other end is called the A unit, and that has an A on it. And the middle one here is C. Now on 5-unit cars you have an A, B, and then C, D, E are the intermediate cars. Now in addition to articulated well cars, You also have drawbar connected well cars, and I have a prototype photo of one here that I shot up at Ackerville, Wisconsin, to illustrate what those look like. And instead of having one truck in the middle, you see that each unit has a truck on each end. And then there's a drawbar that runs between the draft gearbox of each of those units. Drawbar connected well cars like this can come in 3 and 4 unit sets. So that's another neat thing if you're looking at modeling intermodal traffic. To learn more about intermodal cars, check out Jeff Wilson's book, Modern Freight Cars. Chapter 8 covers well cars, spine cars, and piggyback flats. There's a lot of great prototype information in there for both rail fans and modelers, so you can check that out at the Kalmbach Hobby Store or any outlets that carry Kalmbach Media books. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of AskTrains.com. If you have questions about prototype trains, model trains, or toy trains, send us an email, asktrains@trains.com. Thanks for watching.